He stood at the checkout line with nothing but a wrinkled shirt and a handful of change. Dozens of employees saw him struggling. But every single one turned away, except her. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Charles Langford zipped up a faded brown jacket that hadn't seen daylight in years. The sleeves were frayed, and the fabric still held the faint scent of cedar from the attic. He glanced at himself in the mirror, gray stubble and shaven. Baseball cap tugged low, jeans worn soft with time. He looked nothing like the man who sat at the head of a mahogany table 5 days a week. That was the point. Charles wasn't just any executive. He was the CEO of Luma Retail, one of the largest supermarket chains in the country. But today, he wasn't walking into a boardroom. He was heading to one of his own stores, on foot. Dressed like someone down on his luck. Not for PR, not for charity. He needed to see the truth. And the truth never sat neatly on a PowerPoint slide. LUMA's customer satisfaction reports had started to shift. They weren't tanking, but they were wobbling. A slight dip here, a polite complaint there. Most brushed it off. But Charles had seen enough companies rot from the inside by ignoring early signs. He refused to let his become one of them. The location he picked was a store on the outskirts of town. Once praised for its community-first approach. Lately, whispers had surfaced. Cold stares, rushed service, people saying it didn't feel the same. He'd read the reports, but numbers didn't show you tone. They didn't show how it felt to be invisible. With nothing but an old wallet in his back pocket and a weathered tote bag in hand, Charles took the bus and walked the last few blocks. He passed a pawn shop, a closed laundromat, and a gas station where teenagers huddled around loud music. The sun was still warming up the morning, but sweat beaded along his brow, not from heat, but from something else, nerves, maybe, or anticipation. As he stepped through the parking lot, a security guard leaned against the sliding glass doors. The guard's eyes scanned him slowly, not out of concern but with a flicker of judgment. He didn't move, didn't even nod. Charles offered a smile anyway, but it hung in the air unanswered. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly. The aisles were neatly stacked, pristine even, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the cashier's eyes glazed over as she scanned groceries without a word. Or how a clerk stocking cereal boxes moved aside for a woman in heels but turned his back to Charles like he wasn't even there. He wandered the store deliberately, picked up a bag of rice, checked prices, searched for someone to ask about coupons or weekly deals. No one stopped, no one offered help. A young employee passed by, pushing a broom, glanced at Charles and then turned down another aisle without a word. Not rude, just uninterested. As he neared the back of the store, he felt it more acutely, the quiet dismissal. A mother ushered her child to the side as he reached for a can of soup. A man in slacks offered a quick glance and then stepped ahead of him in line. Never acknowledging him, Charles lingered near the checkout lanes, where each beep of scanned items sounded like a metronome of indifference. He waited for a pause, clutching his small bundle, just rice and milk. Essentials. He stepped to an open register. But the cashier picked up a closed sign and set it down without meeting his eyes. The next lane had a customer unloading a cart. The cashier there offered no gesture to let Charles squeeze in, just kept scanning. He stepped back, unsure of where to go, holding the bag a little tighter. He could feel it happening, what he'd feared. Not malice, not outright disrespect, just the kind of subtle erasure people in suits rarely see. Then came the voice. "Sir, I can help you here." It was soft but steady. From the far end of the checkout row, a young woman had stepped out from behind her register. She wore a Luma apron and a name tag that read, Julia. She had kind eyes, tired, maybe, but present, real. Charles blinked. "Oh, thank you," he murmured. Julia motioned him over, taking the items gently from his hands. She didn't ask for a membership card, didn't question why he was paying with change. She just smiled and said, "Milk's on sale today. You save 60 cents. He chuckled lightly. "That's good news." As she bagged the groceries, she leaned in slightly. "You doing okay, sir? Need anything else?" Her voice held no judgment. Just care. The kind of care that couldn't be trained into someone. It came from within. As she handed him the bag, Charles noticed a tall man in a blazer, store manager, perhaps, standing near the customer service desk, watching, arms crossed, expression tight. Julia saw it too but didn't flinch. Charles offered a quiet thank you and left without looking back. But as the automatic doors slid open, a thought landed in his chest heavier than the groceries in his arms. He'd just seen more truth in that 10-minute exchange than in any quarterly report. And tomorrow, the store and Julia were going to see who he really was. The rain had started to come down just as Charles stepped out of the store. Not hard, just a soft mist that dampened the sidewalk and made everything smell like wet pavement and distant soil. He pulled his jacket tighter and walked toward the nearest bus stop. The small brown paper bag crinkling in his hand. Inside it, a bag of rice, a carton of milk, and, unexpectedly, a small loaf of bread, still warm. Back in the store, Julia had handed it to him with a quiet smile. She'd noticed he was short a few cents and, without a moment's hesitation, pulled out her own wallet. No questions, no drama, just a quiet act of kindness that left him slightly stunned. "You need a little something extra today," she had said. "This one didn't sell. Better it goes to someone than in the trash." He'd wanted to say more, maybe something sincere, but found himself nodding and murmuring a simple thank you. He wasn't used to being speechless. As the bus pulled up, he climbed aboard and sat near the back, rain tapping gently against the windows. Pulling a small notebook from his jacket, he began writing, page after page filled with observations, details, and fragments of thought. The way the guard had looked through him, the absence of eye contact, the transactional tone from most employees, the quiet indifference, and then Julia, her voice, her hands, her choice to see him as a person. That kind of integrity didn't just survive in broken systems, it resisted them. On the second floor of the same store, inside a cramped office with gray walls and buzzing fluorescent lights, Bradley Foster leaned forward in his swivel chair, arms folded across his chest. The surveillance footage played back on a monitor in front of him, showing Julia at Register 6 assisting the older man in the beat-up jacket. He didn't like it. He pressed a button on the desk phone and waited. When the other end picked up, his voice dropped into something colder. "Yeah, it's Foster. We got a situation. One of my girls stepped out of line again. Broke protocol. Went soft for some street guy. Might want to flag this one." There was a pause, then a faint response, something low, muffled. Bradley nodded, lips thin. "Got it. I'll write her up." He ended the call, eyes still fixed on the screen. His fingers drummed slowly against the desk. That evening, Charles sat at the kitchen table in his modest condo on the west side. He had changed back into regular clothes, sweater, slippers, the familiar softness of home. But the weight of the day hadn't left him. The loaf of bread sat on the counter, still mostly untouched. He'd eaten a slice but kept looking at it as if it carried more meaning than just flour and yeast. His laptop was open, filled with quarterly reports and internal reviews from LUMA's various locations. The store he'd visited had an unusually high customer satisfaction rating, above average. Even glowing. That didn't add up. He dug deeper. A few staff surveys from earlier in the year hinted at low morale. One anonymous response mentioned pressure to push through positive reviews and discourage complaints at the register. That same employee's ID had since been marked inactive. Another flag. He leaned back, the notebook beside him now filled with scribbles and circles. Something wasn't right. Someone had either gamed the data or covered up the reality. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft buzz from his phone. A new email. He reached for it, expecting something trivial, but the subject line froze him. Disciplinary notice. Julia Ruiz. He tapped it open. The sender was an internal HR address. The message was short. Employee Julia Ruiz has been placed on temporary suspension pending review of service protocol violations. Incident logged at 3:42 p.m. Allegation. Deviation from standardized customer interaction policy. No mention of Charles. No reference to what actually happened. Just cold, bureaucratic language wrapping up an act of decency as if it were a mistake. He reread it twice. A quiet anger stirred in his chest. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that tightens the jaw, stiffens the spine, and sharpens focus. He looked again at the bread. Still warm, still generous. A small act that cost nothing but meant everything. This wasn't about protocol. It was about control. About keeping the surface shiny while something rotted underneath. Charles stood slowly, walked over to his desk, and reached for the sealed leather folder labeled Confidential Internal Oversight. He hadn't opened it in years. Until now. Charles returned to the store 2 days later, dressed in the same worn jacket, his hair left slightly disheveled. He walked with the deliberate pace of someone who didn't want to draw attention, but still noticed everything. This time, he wasn't here to shop. He was here to listen. The store looked no different. The same bright banners with slogans like, "Every customer matters," hung above aisles lined with neat shelves. But Charles knew better than to trust what was printed in bold font. Truth, he'd learned over the years, rarely wore a name tag. He wandered the back of the store until he found a stockroom door slightly ajar. The hum of a pallet jack echoed faintly beyond. Through the crack, he caught sight of a young man wiping his hands on his apron. Leaning over a clipboard, Charles recognized him from the old employee newsletters, Miguel Rivera. 3 years ago, Miguel had been featured for excellence in teamwork. Now, the mop in his hand and the weariness on his face told a different story. Charles stepped inside just far enough to be noticed without startling him. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his tone soft. "You wouldn't happen to remember me, would you?" Miguel looked up, his brow furrowed. "You the guy with the rice and milk?" Charles gave a nod. "You've got a good memory. Hard to forget someone the whole store ignored." There was no bitterness in Miguel's voice. Just a kind of quiet realism that comes from seeing too much and saying too little. Charles stepped closer. "I'm looking for the young woman who helped me. Julia. I wanted to thank her properly." Miguel paused, then set down the mop. "They suspended her, said she broke protocol. But everyone knows that's just code for not towing the line." Charles kept his voice steady. "Has that happened before?" Miguel let out a slow breath. "More times than I can count. Folks speak up about how things really run. And suddenly they're reassigned, put on the worst shifts, or written up until they quit. I was in inventory, filed a report about missing shipments that never got logged. 2 weeks later, I'm back here scrubbing floors. Did anyone ever follow up on your report?" Charles asked. Miguel shook his head. "It disappeared. System said, access denied, next time I tried to open it." Charles thanked him, left his number under the name, Mr. Franklin, and moved on. He didn't want Miguel to know yet who he really was. Not until he could offer more than just questions. Back out on the street, Charles walked 2 blocks to a modest little cafe with chipped paint on the windows and the smell of burnt espresso in the air. The kind of place workers came after long shifts, where the coffee wasn't great, but the company was familiar. He spotted her instantly. Julia sat near the window, a half-empty mug in front of her, eyes cast down at her phone. She looked tired, not just in the physical way, but with a kind of heaviness that weighed at the edges of her posture. Charles approached slowly and tapped the back of the chair across from her. "Mind if I sit?" Julia glanced up, her eyes widened, then softened. She gestured for him to join her. "I didn't expect to see you again," she said. "I had to thank you." Charles replied, "You didn't have to help me. But you did, and it mattered." Julia gave a tired smile. "I just treated you like a person. That shouldn't be exceptional." He nodded. Still, it meant something. They talked for a while. The conversation easy, unforced. Julia told him about her mom, how years ago they'd gone to a store not unlike Luma. Her mother wore a worn coat and had trouble finding her loyalty card. The cashier refused to help, said she was holding up the line. That night, her mother cried in the car. "I promised myself," Julia said quietly, "that if I ever worked in retail, I'd never make someone feel like that." Charles watched her, his chest tight. She wasn't just kind, she had integrity, and she was paying the price for it. He didn't press further, just listened, then thanked her again and left a tip with his coffee, far more than the cost of his drink. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, the afternoon light was beginning to dip. Long shadows stretched across the pavement. and the wind carried a cooler edge. He felt a strange pull in his gut, part instinct, part memory. Crossing the street, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. A man in a Luma uniform, standing near a payphone no one used anymore, pretending to scroll through his phone. Charles didn't stare, he just kept walking, but when he reached the end of the block, his phone buzzed. No name, no subject, just one sentence. "Stop now, you're being watched." The message Charles received the night before still lingered in his thoughts the next morning. He hadn't slept much, but it wasn't fear that kept him up, it was resolve. He sat at his kitchen table again, fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup, mind already racing ahead. If they were watching him, it meant he was close to something worth hiding. He opened his old address book, not digital, the leather one with creased pages and fading ink. Flipping through names, he landed on one that stirred both memory and trust. Sophia Brandt. She'd started at Luma the same year he had. Back then, she worked in store ops. A sharp-eyed problem solver with a sense of fairness that matched his own. Now she held the title of Senior Director of Customer Experience. They hadn't spoken much since he moved into the CEO role. But he remembered the last thing she said to him over drinks 2 years ago. "If this place ever stops putting people first, I hope someone rattles the cage." He dialed her personal number, not the corporate one. She answered on the third ring. "Charles? Wow, it's been a minute. I need your eyes on something," he said, off the record. Sophia listened carefully as he walked her through everything. The visit to the store, Julia, the cold service, the suspension, and the numbers that didn't add up. When he finished, there was a beat of silence. "That's not possible," she finally said. "That store's been reporting clean for over a year. High scores, no flags. If there's been a cover-up, it's buried deep, which is why I'm calling you," Charles replied. She hesitated, then agreed to pull some data and look into initiating a surprise audit. But 2 hours later, she called back, this time from her car, her voice lower than before. "I tried," she said, "but I got blocked. My request never even made it past the firewall. Got flagged and bounced by senior compliance. Apparently, we're under a no disruption policy until after quarterly earnings. They don't want anything disturbing the flow." Charles wasn't surprised, but the confirmation stung. He thanked her, then hung up, fingers tightening around the phone. If the top wouldn't let the truth come through, he'd have to bring it from the bottom up. Later that evening, Charles met Julia and Miguel at a quiet diner on the edge of town. The kind of place where the waitresses called you, "hun," and refilled coffee without asking. They sat in a corner booth, speaking in soft tones over lukewarm pie and fries. Julia slid a small box across the table. Inside were 3 key fobs disguised as pens. "Hidden cameras," she said. "Battery lasts about 4 hours. You'll need to keep them moving or they freeze." Miguel pulled out a crude map of the store layout and pointed to blind spots. "Here, behind the freezer aisle, no cameras. They do most of their disciplinary talks there." Charles nodded. "We get real footage, real voices, customers ignored, complaints dismissed, employees shut down, no edits, no filters. We'll need more than video," Julia said. "People who are willing to talk, even off record. I have a few names," Miguel added, "but they're scared. If word gets out, we'll protect them," Charles promised. Just as they were finalizing the plan, the bell above the diner door jingled. A tall figure stepped inside, scanning the room before walking toward them. It was Ethan Monroe. Julia looked shocked. "You still live around here?" "I've been keeping a low profile," Ethan said, sliding into the booth beside Miguel. "Heard you were stirring the pot." Ethan had once been a rising star at Luma, assistant manager with a spotless record. But 6 months ago, he was quietly forced out. No warning, no farewell, just gone. Rumor was he refused to fudge a customer survey log during a quarterly review. "I still have copies of the real reports," Ethan said, pulling a flash drive from his coat. "And I know exactly who's been scrubbing the numbers. Bradley's just a pawn." Charles took the drive, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Not in gigabytes, but in consequences. That night, back home, he sat at his desk again, with Julia's footage, Miguel's map, and Ethan's reports. He started drafting a case for internal review. Sophia had agreed to send it to a contact in the Compliance Oversight Committee, quietly, from a personal channel. But just before he could hit send, his screen flickered, then froze. His email client logged out. He tried logging back in, but the system denied access. He checked his phone. One missed call from Sophia. He called her back. It rang once. Then a text arrived. Account frozen. I've been pulled for questioning. Suspended. No access to internal systems. Charles stared at the message, a bitter taste rising in his mouth. They weren't just watching him anymore. They were striking back. The office felt colder than usual. Maybe it was just Charles's nerves. But as he sat staring at the error message on his locked account, something inside him knew this was bigger than just a suspension or a system hiccup. Someone wanted the trail to go cold. And fast. He barely had time to gather his thoughts when a thick envelope arrived by courier. Hand-delivered. No return address. Just his name, typed in neat, bold letters on the front. Inside was a crisp letter on official Luma letterhead. An invitation. Mr. Charles Langford, we are pleased to invite you as a guest of honor to our upcoming Excellence in Customer Service Regional Summit. This event is designed to recognize top-performing branches across the district and will take place at the Maple Glen Luma location this Thursday. Warm regards, Raymond Wells, Regional Executive Director. Charles stared at the signature. Raymond Wells. That was a name he hadn't seen in any internal thread since this all began. The man had stayed conspicuously absent during the shake-ups and email blackouts. Now he wanted to roll out the red carpet? The timing was too perfect. Charles knew a performance when he saw one. But if Raymond was trying to put on a show, maybe it was time he sat front row. On Thursday morning, Charles arrived at the Maple Glen store dressed in his usual blazer and neutral slacks. Leaving the disguise at home, he didn't announce who he was. But he no longer cared if someone recognized him. The lobby had been transformed. Bright banners stretched from wall to wall with slogans like, "Serving with Heart," and "Proud to be Luma." A catered refreshment table offered coffee in real china cups, no paper in sight. The crowd was full of hand-picked employees and clean-cut customers, who greeted each other like extras from a casting call. Charles scanned the room. Everyone seemed rehearsed, every conversation choreographed. The store itself had been scrubbed to a shine. New uniforms, polished carts, and friendly greetings from every direction. He watched as a camera crew filmed smiling employees high-fiving each other while handing out sample coupons. This wasn't recognition, it was damage control. A tall man in a tailored gray suit approached him. Tan skin, steel blue eyes, voice smooth as glass. "Charles," the man said warmly, "you finally made it." "Raymond Wells," Charles replied, shaking his hand. "I was wondering when you'd step out of the shadows." Raymond gave a practiced chuckle. "No shadows here, just a bit of well-earned celebration." They chatted lightly for a moment, but Charles could feel the pressure behind the politeness. Every word from Raymond felt like it had been measured, tested, and sanded down until there was no edge left. Eventually, Raymond leaned in closer. "I know things have gotten tangled," he said softly, "but let's be clear, Charles. You and we both want what's best for Luma. Maybe we just have different ways of getting there." Charles didn't respond. "You've done good work," Raymond continued. "Built a legacy. I'd hate to see it end in conflict. We're prepared to offer you a graceful retirement, public recognition, a generous exit package, and Julia, she'll get her job back. Fully reinstated." Charles studied his face. "As long as I keep quiet." Raymond smiled, unbothered. "Let's call it perspective." Elsewhere in the room, Julia stood near the back wall. She had been called in last minute and handed a short speech, typed and stapled, requesting her to thank corporate leadership for their support through recent challenges. Her fingers clutched the paper, but she never moved to the podium. A junior HR representative whispered to her, urging her forward. Julia shook her head. "I'm not saying that," she said simply, folding the paper and handing it back. Raymond, watching from a distance, turned away without acknowledging the moment. Then came the surprise. As the event reached its final segment, an MC took the microphone and announced a special guest speaker, someone from within the Luma family who had faced adversity with grace and could speak to the power of LUMA's support network. From the side door, Ethan Monroe stepped onto the stage. Charles froze. Ethan, who had passed along secret reports, warned about data manipulation, and helped expose the early cracks, now stood in front of the crowd. Smiling politely, "I'm honored to be back," Ethan began. "This company has always been about second chances. And thanks to leadership that listens, I found mine again." He went on to describe how the systems in place worked, how oversight had improved, how customer satisfaction had reached new highs. The words rolled off his tongue effortlessly. Too effortlessly. Julia turned away, visibly shaken. Charles remained still, listening to every word as if they were daggers wrapped in ribbon. Ethan was no longer fighting the system. He joined it. The applause from the customer service summit hadn't even faded from Charles's ears when the unraveling began. What started as a single thread, Ethan's sudden betrayal, quickly became a full tear in the fragile network Charles had built. Julia stopped returning texts. When he drove by the store the next day, her nameplate was gone. No explanation, no forwarding contact. Miguel's shift had been reassigned overnight. No farewell, no time to talk. The only word passed along by another employee was that he'd been relocated for training support. It was the kind of phrase used when someone was being disappeared without drama. The corporate version of a vanishing act. And Sophia, loyal, capable, principled Sophia, had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal ethics review. She sent Charles a short voice message. Her tone was weary, but not angry. "I'm okay," she said. "Don't worry about me. Just finish what you started." Charles sat in his office that night with the lights off, watching the reflection of the city through his window. The skyline blinked back at him like a question he didn't want to answer. For a man who'd spent years building Luma from the inside, who once believed in its potential to be different, better, he now felt like a guest in his own house. And then came the final push. A formal letter from the board arrived by courier. No calls, no meeting, just one page, signed by 3 executives. Charles, given recent transitions and the evolving direction of Luma Retail's long-term strategy, we believe it is in the company's best interest to offer you a dignified early retirement. We appreciate your service and legacy. Sincerely, Luma Retail Board of Directors. He read it once, then again, and folded it neatly into the trash. That afternoon, a meeting of the regional directors was held at headquarters. It was meant to be routine, a policy rollout, updated language on surveys, a new staff evaluation template. But the language was too polished, too calculated. When Raymond stood up in front of the room and announced a company-wide standardization of customer response metrics, everyone nodded as if it were common sense. But Charles heard what they didn't say. They were tightening the grip. Real complaints would be scrubbed before they reached review. Survey scores would be balanced by algorithm. Field audits would now require pre-approval. In short, they weren't fixing the system. They were burying the evidence. Charles sat through the meeting in silence. He watched familiar faces, some indifferent, others quietly resigned, but one, sitting 2 rows behind Raymond, met his gaze. A man in his mid-50s. Trim mustache, pressed shirt. His name was Harold Dane, mid-level operations manager. Not loud, not a known ally, just someone who usually blended in. As the room emptied, Harold brushed past Charles and, with a quick motion, slid a small object into his blazer pocket. "Don't say anything," Harold whispered, "but not all of us are asleep." Charles said nothing, just gave him a nod. Back home that night, he pulled out the USB and plugged it into a secure laptop he hadn't used in years. For a while, there was nothing, just folders with generic titles. Meeting_logs. Finance_notes. Review_cycle. Then he found it, an audio file labeled simply, greenlight.mp3. He hit play. 2 voices. One clearly Raymond's, calm and smooth as ever. The other belonged to a man named Peter Chase, the director of data operations. They talked numbers, schedules. Then things turned. "If the report shows even a 4-point dip," Peter said, "the board's gonna ask questions." "They won't see it," Raymond replied. "Flag any survey below a certain score. Reroute complaints to the Tier C bin. We're not here to nurse feelings, we're protecting value. And the whistleblowers? Identify, isolate, replace. Charles sat still, fists tightening in his lap. Toward the end of the clip, there was talk of deleting audit logs, encrypting employee warnings. It was clinical, unapologetic. But one folder on the USB refused to open. Encrypted with a level of protection Charles hadn't seen outside of national security contracts. Whoever set it up knew what they were doing. He'd need outside help. He leaned back in his chair, mind running fast. There was still a path forward, if he could get this to the right hands. If he could bypass internal controls. But he'd have to move carefully now. Someone was already watching too closely. He didn't hear the doorbell at first. It rang once, soft, measured. Charles opened the door, expecting a delivery or maybe Harold again. No one was there. Just a folded sheet of paper on the doormat. He bent down, picked it up. 5 words. Don't think you're the only one with a copy. Charles left the glass tower without a goodbye. He didn't pack a single framed photo or take the brass nameplate from his desk. Everything he needed, he already carried, in a flash drive hidden in his coat pocket. And a memory that burned hotter than any press release the board could issue. He didn't look back as the automatic doors shut behind him. The air outside felt heavier, like something was shifting. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove 2 hours north, past the sprawl of city streets, past the business parks with names that all sounded the same, until he reached a neighborhood tucked behind a shuttered train station. There, in a narrow alley above an old bike repair shop, sat the apartment he once rented back when his bank account had barely held more than a few $100s. The paint was still peeling. The mailbox still leaned crooked. He climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the rail, and unlocked the door. Inside, everything smelled faintly of dust and time. The windows stuck a little when he tried to open them. The fridge was empty, but the stove still clicked like it always had before the flame kicked in. He dropped his keys on the same chipped counter where he once used to make coffee at 5 a.m. before early shifts. This place had no cameras, no buzzers, no eyes, and that made it safe. That evening, Charles made one call. She picked up after 2 rings. Voice low, but sharp as ever. Well, I'll be damned. Charles Langford, you looking for a quote? Or a fight? Neither, he said. I'm looking for a favor. One I won't ask lightly. Linda Ortega had been a union organizer, then a stringer, and now one of the last real investigative journalists in town. She'd seen more than her share of cover-ups and knew exactly how systems turned on the people who built them. More importantly, she was one of the few people left who remembered who Charles used to be, before the title. The boardroom, the speeches. They met that night in a corner booth at a diner off Route 7. She wore her hair tied back, her coat too big for the booth, her notebook already out before he even sat down. I need help cracking an encrypted file, Charles said. It's corporate, internal, the kind of thing that could burn careers. Is that what you want now? Linda asked, pen poised. To burn something down? No, he said quietly. I want to drag it into the light. She nodded once and slid a battered laptop across the table. Then let's get started. For the next 2 hours, they picked apart strings of code and encryption layers. While the server refilled their coffee like clockwork, Charles kept his eyes on the screen. But his mind drifted to all the faces now silent. Sophia, Miguel, Harold, people who had risked more than just jobs. People who had trusted him. Later that week, Linda cracked it. A hidden folder labeled RCMLM Comms. Inside were PDFs of wire transfers, emails flagged as MediaSync, and a full calendar linking Raymond to a third-party PR firm, Clearway Strategies. According to the documents, Luma had paid the firm over $300,000 in the last year for reputation stabilization, internal engagement scripting, and controlled exposure media events. Controlled exposure. Linda repeated aloud. They're not just manipulating data. They're scripting the entire story. And it wasn't just public. The emails included drafts of employee newsletters, social media blurbs, even pre-written testimonials that junior staff were asked to post online. All manufactured, all carefully timed. Charles sat back, the weight of it finally settling in. It was never just about numbers. It was the narrative, the illusion, that everything was fine. Meanwhile, Julia hadn't gone quiet. Despite being suspended, she continued working the customer floor off the books, gathering real complaints from customers who felt ignored or mistreated. She sent them through a trusted friend on night shift who dropped them in a locked mailbox outside Charles's building. Each envelope filled with hand-scribbled notes, names, receipts, time-stamped comments. She signed each packet with only one word, "Still here." But something darker was stirring. Charles couldn't reach Harold. Emails bounced. Phone strayed to voicemail. When he called LUMA's main line to check his status, a voice coolly informed him that Harold had accepted an international relocation opportunity. No forwarding information, no internal contact. He stared at the receiver a long while after that. It didn't feel like promotion. It felt like removal. Then came Julia's message. A simple text. No words. Just a video file. Charles played it in the dim light of his apartment. The laptop balanced on his knees. The footage was shaky. Phone camera angled from behind a shelf near the front registers. The audio was muffled, but clear enough to make out the voice. Raymond, standing close to an elderly employee, thin, white-haired, wearing a Luma vest that looked 2 sizes too big. Charles recognized him instantly. Tom Whitaker, his old friend, his first hire at Luma 30 years ago. The man who used to fix the store clock on his own dime, just so customers wouldn't be late for the bus. On the screen, Raymond leaned in too close and hissed through his teeth. "You don't fit our new image. Walk out now, before someone makes that decision for you." Tom didn't respond. Raymond turned and walked away. Charles sat there, still as stone, staring at the paused frame. The man who once taught him to stock a shelf with dignity had just been tossed aside like a broken broom. Something in Charles shifted then. This wasn't just business anymore. It was personal. The plan wasn't elegant. It wasn't flashy, or tech-savvy, or backed by a team of lawyers in suits. It was something else. Something Charles hadn't relied on in years. It was heart. Linda laid out the framework across her kitchen table. Folders stacked in rows. Color-coded tabs sticking out like flags at war. Julia had delivered 2 more handwritten accounts from displaced employees. And one blurry photo of Tom, now working as a stockboy at a local corner store. Not because he needed the money, but because he didn't know how not to work. They had everything they needed. The video of Raymond, the ledger showing hush payments to Clearway Strategies, audio files, complaint logs, call recordings, internal emails, and the names of 17 employees who had either been forced out or quietly moved off the grid. But the moment, that had to be chosen carefully. Annual shareholder meeting, Linda said, tracing a date on the calendar. Open to the press. Broadcast live. Major investors, media, even a few government regulators show up for this one. Charles looked at her. "They'll never let us near the mic." "You don't need the mic," she replied. "You need the moment." Julia worked behind the scenes, contacting former employees who still cared enough to stand with them. Linda's team of freelance techs rigged a backup livestream in case the official broadcast cut out. They even looped in a few sympathetic junior reporters from the city press who were tired of feeding off press releases and wanted the real story. Charles rehearsed what he would say, but it never came out the same way twice. What mattered was the truth, and the weight of it. The day of the meeting, he wore no tie, just the same brown jacket he had worn on the first day he took the job at Luma. Back when it was 3 locations and 1 rusty truck. Linda walked beside him, recording gear tucked into her shoulder bag, camera already rolling. The conference hall buzzed with polite tension. PR reps whispered behind glossy brochures, and the investors took their seats like royalty arriving late to court. Raymond took the stage with a smile so wide it looked painted on. He spoke of growth, of numbers that sparkled, of a company anchored in community values and digital innovation. Then Charles stood. He didn't shout, didn't raise a fist. He just walked slowly down the center aisle with a folder in his hand. Stopped in front of the director's table, and placed it down. "In that file," he said, his voice firm, "you'll find proof of widespread data tampering, employee intimidation, and corporate fraud. It's signed, time-stamped, and traced, right back to your senior leadership." A hush fell across the room. Charles turned toward the crowd. "This isn't about money. It's about people, good people, Who gave everything to a company that turned its back on them? Security hesitated at the edge of the stage, unsure whether to step in. Raymond stood, adjusting his cufflinks, trying to laugh it off. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "let's be clear. What you've just witnessed is a deeply unfortunate outburst from a man who is no longer associated with this company in any official capacity. His allegations are baseless, fabricated, and frankly, sad." He gave a shrug, the kind meant to look sympathetic. "This is a retired executive struggling to find relevance. I encourage everyone here not to be distracted by theatrics." The live broadcast cut to black, but Linda's feed did not. Her independent stream had been running from the back of the room, feeding directly to thousands of viewers watching online. Comments exploded on screen. Journalists began typing furiously. Phones buzzed like alarms. Raymond started to sweat, just barely, a twitch in his jaw, a glance toward the side door. Then it opened. From the shadows stepped Sophia. She wasn't supposed to be there. Still officially suspended, still under internal review. But as she walked to the stage, a hush fell deeper. She carried no folder, just a flash drive. "I held onto something," she said, plugging it into the presentation monitor. "It's the server activity log from our internal data network. These entries can be forged. They include login timestamps, IP addresses, and exact changes made to customer feedback records." The screen behind her flickered to life. A spreadsheet appeared, rows and rows of logs. Each entry showed edits made to customer data. Each edit made under a single username. Raymond Wells. The room didn't gasp, it exhaled. Silence spread like ink in water. A tension released. A truth laid bare. Raymond's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't move, didn't speak. His hands clenched at his sides, fingers curling into his palms. And Charles watched him, not with triumph, but with something closer to mourning. For what Luma had become. The room was still, not silent like before, but heavier, like air waiting to break. Sophia had stepped away from the projector. Her arms crossed, jaw set, as if daring anyone to claim it was fake. Raymond didn't move for a full 5 seconds. Then, with slow precision, he adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and leaned into the microphone. "I don't know where this so-called evidence came from," he said evenly, "but what you've seen is a collection of out-of-context data. Misinterpreted, possibly fabricated. This is nothing more than a coordinated smear campaign." Some heads in the audience turned toward each other. Whispers buzzed low, almost hesitant. Raymond straightened his back. "And I won't stand here and allow this company to be hijacked by a few disgruntled former employees with a personal vendetta." That was when a voice cut through the room. "Then why," said Harold Bennett, senior board member and longtime ally of Raymond, "did you suspend the person who discovered the manipulation instead of investigating it?" All eyes turned. Bennett, silver-haired and usually quiet during meetings, had his tablet folded under one arm. But his gaze was direct, sharp. And why were system logs wiped the day after that suspension? Why were entire feedback archives flagged for deletion? Raymond's smile didn't quite hold. "That's internal housekeeping," he replied, trying to chuckle. "Routine system maintenance. Harold, you know how messy legacy databases can be." Bennett didn't smile back. He remained standing. Charles walked forward, not taking the stage this time, but stepping just close enough for his voice to carry. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. He looked directly at Raymond and asked, "Did you ever, just once, care about the person behind those numbers?" Raymond's lips parted, but nothing came out. Charles continued, "You quoted market share, growth percentages, cost per complaint. But those complaints? They had names. They were mothers, veterans, young families, people trying to feed their kids on a tight budget. You erased them." And then Julia stepped forward. She looked smaller under the lights, still wearing her plain button-up shirt, her employee ID hanging from a lanyard she hadn't taken off since her suspension. In her hands was a stack of papers, slightly bent at the corners. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she held them out. "These are letters," she said quietly, "handwritten, emails, printed messages from customers who took the time to say thank you. Thank you for someone bagging their groceries with care, for helping them find medicine, for treating them like they mattered. She walked toward the board table and gently placed them down, one by one. And here, she said, holding up a final sheet, is the internal system flag that marked every single one of these as non-priority, meaning they were never forwarded, never logged, and eventually deleted. You could hear someone exhale in the back of the room. It wasn't outrage, it was disappointment, the kind that settled deep in the bones. Raymond's composure snapped. He slammed a fist onto the podium. This is absurd. This is orchestrated slander by a bunch of washed-up rebels and part-timers clinging to a past that doesn't exist anymore. His voice rose, cracking at the edges. You think any of this matters? Do you know how the world works now? It's optics. It's scale. It's about controlling perception. Then he paused. Just for a second. But long enough. He caught himself mid-rant and glanced to the side as if someone had just reminded him where he was. The audience had frozen. Phones were being held high. Some people were filming. Others just stared. He muttered something under his breath. Then louder. You all don't get it. None of this gets approved without. Look, I wasn't working alone. The words hung in the air. Charles didn't move. Neither did Linda or Sophia. But Julia did. She took one slow step back. Her brows furrowed. What do you mean, not alone? Raymond swallowed. His eyes darted left, toward the board. There are directives. There's structure. I didn't write the playbook. And then, without warning, someone in the back of the hall stood. A woman in her 60s. Hair silver and pulled neatly behind her shoulders. Adjusted her glasses and stepped toward the aisle. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She simply turned and walked toward the exit. Charles saw her clearly. Evelyn Hartman, chairwoman of the board, her face unreadable, her posture steady. She didn't look back, not once. But before the door closed behind her, she glanced toward Charles, just a flicker. Not of surprise, but something colder. Recognition. She already knew. The morning after the shareholder meeting, headlines lit up across national news, on cable, talk radio, and the internet. It was the same. A scandal that stretched beyond numbers and into the heart of trust. Massive customer data manipulation uncovered at Luma Retail, read one. Another declared, the truth behind the smile. Former CEO exposes dark side of retail giant. Raymond's name was everywhere, suspended, under investigation. His face, once used in ads celebrating corporate innovation, now filled screens under bold text questioning ethics and corruption. But the world inside the company shifted faster than the headlines could keep up. Julia walked into the same store where it had all started, but this time through the employee entrance marked, authorized personnel only. No longer a cashier, no longer invisible, she was now the National Customer Service Training Director. Her first order of business, to change the training manual. Page 1 now read, every customer is a human being. Start there. Sophia returned too, not with caution, but conviction. The board had invited her back, and she'd taken the offer with one condition: full independence over the internal audit division. She would no longer be someone who whispered warnings from the sidelines. She now had a seat that couldn't be quietly pulled out from under her. Linda Ortega, the journalist who'd helped turn a USB into a firestorm, was honored that same month at the National Association of Independent Journalists. She didn't prepare a speech. When asked what fueled her persistence, she simply replied, because truth doesn't knock politely. Sometimes, you have to kick the door in. And Charles? He declined the fancy new title, the glass office they offered him again. Instead, he packed his bags and returned to a quieter life, teaching leadership and ethics at the same community college where he once studied by night while stocking shelves by day. His students, most of them working-class kids juggling jobs, sat up straighter when he spoke, not because of who he used to be, but because of how he made things feel possible. On the last day of the semester, in a sunlit classroom with chipped paint and mismatched chairs, he closed the course not with a summary, but with a story. You know, he began, hands folded on the desk. The good you do might not pay off next week. It might not even pay off in your lifetime. But it builds something. And what it builds is bigger than a paycheck. Bigger than a headline. It builds trust. And that, he paused, looking around the room at the eyes fixed on him. That's what makes a system worth keeping. Applause didn't erupt. No one stood. But the room felt change. Like the kind of silence that stays with you longer than any speech. That evening, back at his modest home tucked between old trees and gravel roads, Charles settled at his desk. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows through his blinds. He reached for the power button, ready to shut down the old laptop when a notification blinked in the corner of the screen. New message, no subject, no name. He opened it. One line. Raymond was just a seat warmer. I'm still running things from the 19th floor. Charles didn't move. He stared at the sentence for a long time. Not out of fear, but familiarity. He reached for his mouse. Clicked to trace the IP address. It pinged back to the corporate headquarters. Same building. Same signal. Same rot. He leaned back in his chair, hands steepled beneath his chin. The glow of the screen reflected off his glasses. But his eyes were calm. Steady. He closed the laptop slowly, the click echoing in the quiet of the room. Then he smiled, not because the fight was over, but because he finally knew where to aim. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves us with. In a world driven by numbers and polished appearances, who still dares to see the person behind the struggle? Julia didn't wait for a promotion, a title, or a camera. She simply did what was right. And sometimes, it's that quiet act of decency that shakes the entire system. What would you have done in her shoes? If this story moved you, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths so you never miss the next powerful story hidden in plain sight.